Just a second.
Are we live?
Just a moment. Want to confirm for sure. Yep, you are live.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back. We had a quorum problems, but our fourth member has arrived probably, I'm sure he abided by the speed limits from BWI Airport. In any case, welcome tonight to this regularly scheduled meeting of the Planning Commission. I'm going to call the roll. I'm Robert H. Waldman. Ms. Diane Butler.
Here.
Tom Smokinudis.
Here.
Stephen Riley. Steve, unmute. Yeah.
Present.
Okay, so we have a quorum. The agenda tonight consists of essentially finishing up deliberations on the legislation concerning a prohibition on new drive-through windows and the continuation of the public hearing on the Maritime Industry Development Fund. And we will vote on both of those. There will be no other business because we need to finish shortly before 9:30 tonight because Mr. Riley is an international obligation elsewhere. So we're going to run this rather efficiently. I'm going to ask whether we approve the agenda as I've stated it. Do I hear a motion?
So
Motion.
moved.
And a second?
Second.
Okay. All in favor of that agenda, say aye.
Aye. Aye.
Any nays? All right, let's move forward. 0624, citywide prohibition on new drive-through windows. We heard extensive testimony last meeting. We received one very extensive comment, written comment, and a rather perfunctory comment from lobbyists for the Bankers Association. So without any further public comment, let's move into any discussion and deliberations. Do either of any of you have any comment at this point?
No.
I was curious about the exception, the potential for an exception for banks. I do see that as a pretty benign exception, but I'd love to hear what others think.
Any comment, Mr. Riley?
Am I off mute? Can you hear me?
Yes.
I just think it's when you get into trying to decide this vendor or that industry and that kind of thing, I think it's a little bit of a slippery slope if you start to subjectively assess the value of one's business versus somebody else's. I think that people are, accustomed to drive-through banking and that kind of thing, as compared to our feelings about something like a McDonald's drive-through or another one of those. So I kind of feel torn a little bit because I do see the value of those conveniences to certain communities within the community or certain demographics within the community. But my feeling is it should be kind of like an all or none. I don't know if you can really just say banks are the only thing that we would approve. It just seems
Right, because then it becomes subjective, like you're saying.
Right.
Then we're going to say what, fast food, maybe Taco Bell would be a no, but maybe something else would be you can't really. It is a slippery slope.
I mean, because then you start getting into because I see pharmacies as serving the community on some level, so banks and pharmacies would be something to me that could be looked at a little differently than a restaurant, perhaps.
Okay. Here I have some thoughts on this. First of all, I want to make it very clear on in response to the written comment that we got. this legislation does not intend to remove any existing drive-throughs.
Right.
It only is a prohibition or a ban on any new ones. That's the first thing. The other misconception, which I would like to clarify, is that there were comments made by the two aldermen, especially one of them, that there's no value in Truist Bank or drive-throughs. And the fact, I think that what the alderman meant was it's not that there's no value in the business. There's very little tax revenue value in the parking lots. So nobody's saying that Truist Bank or Starbucks has to go out of business. What they're saying is that any new property which is developed would be prohibited, and that in the existing properties, there's very little value which is attached to asphalt parking lots because the way property is assessed. It's the buildings which are assessed as having value and not really the land. And that applies, by the way, to residential zones as well. As we learned, some of the wealthier zones in the city do not pay their fair share of taxes because their very expensive land is not assessed at market value. Their homes are assessed at market value, but not their lands. So there's that. I think that we need to clarify that. The other thing that I want to say from my personal point of view is that what we're really talking about here are the new developments in this city will be in mixed use, we hope, mixed use environments. And that we want to see those be efficient and compact, and to not have extraneous parking, extraneous asphalt in general. So that's really what the purpose of this is. It's not to constrain any existing businesses. Now, one of the things that the city council may consider is that in new developments, and I'm thinking the Hillsmere Shopping Center is a good example, that the city council may consider that it's valuable to consider banks and pharmacies as having some kind of drive-throughs. Where they should be located on the properties, and how they should be located is really kind of up to them. That's my personal view at this point. But I wanted to clarify that, and I also want to clarify that we're really looking at the few places where we would like to see more compact development. The Annapolis Seafood, for instance, that whole strip in there, that could become something which has residences and small businesses. But if you allow a drive-through, you're going to knock off, 1 to 2, 3 potential small businesses. If there's drive-through lanes and so forth, taking up what would be usable space. Those are my feelings.
I have a little more to add. I just haven't really shared too much of it because I don't want to get too far ahead of technology and where the world is going. But if we're leaning into a 2040 comprehensive plan, the drive-throughs don't make sense. And I think that they're terribly inefficient with regard to land use and the need for asphalt and driving. I also think that the people who are the beneficiaries of them are very, very few in numbers compared to the beneficiaries of having a more pedestrian or bike or otherwise 2040 comprehensive plan friendly. And moreover, I think that home delivery services and the way that that technology and how commerce is evolving so quickly is going to render the drive-through obsolete in a matter of time. So if we allow some of those businesses or some of that build out to happen in the next 2, 3, 4 years or whatever, and they're grandfathered in, then I just think we're kind of walking us in the wrong direction. So that's my personal
I agree
feeling.
with that. I definitely agree with that. I feel like this is our chance to move things forward. And one of the aldermen said that, if a bank or a new pharmacy wants to open up with a drive-through, they can do that easily in the county. And we're only 7 square miles. So somebody that's really burdened that needs to go to a drive-through to do their banking or pharmacy can go right outside, potentially, the city limits to do their banking drive-throughs there. So, yeah, I think I agree with each one of the comments that you all just made. So thank you.
Let me propose this. Do we want to recommend to the council that they consider grandfathering in drive-throughs, but that they allow uses to change? So if for some reason, Kentucky Fried Chicken goes out of business and a bank wants to go in where Kentucky Fried Chicken used to be, and there is already a building and a drive-through, the grandfathering would apply to a new use. Did I make myself clear?
Yes.
Yeah, you're saying that the drive-through runs with the land, essentially.
Yes. Yeah. Yes. Well put. Do we want to suggest that they consider that?
I'd be fine with that.
Okay. Stephen?
I mean, it just makes me, as I own real estate and property, and it just makes me think about the value of the land, and somebody like Kentucky Fried Chicken saying nobody's buying chicken, so I'm going to hold out here and I'm going to inflate the value of this land in the interest of having this special exception. I'd be more interested in saying no if we're not going to grandfather them in, and we might say something like, let's put this to like special exceptions for things like that. It would go through Board of Appeals or something, where it wouldn't be an entitlement. It would be an application consideration.
Right. Are you subject to standards, we say? So it would go to the Board of Appeals and they would decide on that.
I'd be interested in Mr. Jakubiak's or Eric Lashinsky's input on that kind of consideration, just from the city side.
Okay. Okay. So I'm going to call for a vote. Do I hear a motion to recommend approval of this legislation with the added comment that the city council might consider grandfathering in existing drive-throughs for banks and pharmacies and use a special exception with standards process? Did I make myself clear?
Yeah, for me, it's the grandfathering with the special exception. It still has to go through Board of Appeals or something like that.
Okay, and limited to banks and pharmacies, because those are the only things that people have ever said really are necessary for a percentage of the population. Okay, there's my motion. Do I hear a second?
Yeah, I'll second that.
Any discussion on that motion now? Hearing none. All in favor of that, say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Any nays?
Nay.
Okay. Mr. Svakianudis, how about you and I, in combination, write up the findings on this, okay?
Okay.
Great. I'll talk about that with you later. All right. On to our second item on the agenda, which is 01224, Maritime Industry Economic Development Fund. And for this, there is, in fact, a public hearing. And I would like to turn this over to staff, to Mr. Lashinsky, who probably has something to say as usual.
I do want to use some time, just a few minutes really, to try to clarify this ordinance and dispel some rumors that I think are out there, just based on some of the public comments that we've seen come through. There was just one for this week that was sent to the Planning Commission. I think there were 4 submitted last week for last week's meeting. So let me go ahead and share my screen, and you can feel free to ask questions along the way. It's just a handful of slides, nothing extensive here. Are you seeing this first slide?
Yep.
Yes.
Okay. So right away, I just want to say the things that this ordinance does not do, does not change the maritime zoning in any way, does not relate to the annual reporting that I know you all have discussed in the past that's in the city code related to maritime properties. And it doesn't do anything to set the fees. Those were already set in a resolution from 2022 that I'll share in a moment.
Can I ask
The-
a question about that part? Because
Yeah.
like when we were talking to staff a while ago, back in April, and we were asking about the reporting was not robust, to say the least. It was 48%. And so if people aren't reporting, how are we determining how the fees are going to work? That means that if people aren't reporting and then they're asking for, additional space for non-maritime, we won't have the data to even know what their current maritime is. And then the other question is setting fees. If staff didn't understand that this isn't a fee in lieu and they set the fees at $1 per square foot, isn't that going to create a problem? Because they've been potentially explaining it to people as $1 per foot for just essentially a fee in lieu. So is it arbitrary that they picked $1 per square foot? That's what I'm trying to figure out, because some of the uses that we're talking about seem a lot more valuable than $1 per square foot.
Okay, let me answer that last question first. First off, I could have added another bullet here that says it does not refer to a fee in lieu. So there's nothing in this ordinance where fee in lieu is mentioned. There's nothing related to a fee in lieu. It's a very specific fee that only applies to certain properties that use the water access incentives. Let me kind of get through these slides, maybe, and that'll help explain.
Okay, sure.
That's why it doesn't relate to annual reporting, because it'll really only relate to a minuscule subset of maritime properties in the zones, really just only a few perhaps. So, for those who weren't here in 2020, 2021, the Strengthening the Industry report was the outcome of the Maritime Task Force, which was about a year-long process, involved a whole cross-section of maritime industry stakeholders and residents, and it's still on our website if anybody's interested in downloading the document. It's on our comprehensive planning page, and you could just Google it, frankly, and find the full document as well as the executive summary. It's pretty robust. It's only 30 or so, maybe it's 70 pages actually, but it's pretty well illustrated. And in there, just on page 16, you'll see the first mention of this Maritime Industry Fund, which was proposed, and there was broad consensus about the value of such a fund. And, I think unbeknownst to a lot of the people who were participating in the task force, this fund had actually been proposed in 1988 when the maritime districts were originally created. But that fund had never been utilized. And so it's been in the city code all this time, but really there hasn't been any money put towards it, to my knowledge. And it was a fund that was supposed to be administered by the Maritime Advisory Board, which is another volunteer board. So this ordinance is actually not even creating a new fund. It's really just correcting the code that's in there today, describing this fund and making sure that it's clear who is supposed to administer it and how it's supposed to work. In the whereas statements, I want to highlight one in particular that highlights 02521. Now, that was the ordinance that was adopted by the City Council after the Maritime Task Force made its recommendation. So 02521 implemented the recommendations of the Maritime Task Force. It was a pretty extensive ordinance that was thoroughly workshopped by city council and committees. And the fee that would essentially add funds to this maritime industry fund was worked through this ordinance. I'll talk about what that looks like in a moment, but the actual amount of that fee was adopted through R 5422. And that, let's see, I thought I had an image of it. That was determined to be $1 a square foot per year. And Stephen Rice is here. I discussed that with him at the time. I mean, basically the idea was what amount would be provide an incentive for a property to provide water access improvements. What amount wouldn't be prohibitive? And so in looking at rents and sort of overhead of businesses, it seemed that this would be a reasonable amount. And the kind of square footages we're talking about among the properties that would likely take advantage of water access incentives.
So Eric, is just for water access incentives, or if a
that is
business
all
wants
it
to
is. Yes.
So like you want to become a restaurant, for instance, and you want to, you're going to provide a certain number of parking spaces. So you hit the parking trigger, and then you get 5% of your gross floor area. And in some cases, that would double the size of what's currently allowed for a restaurant in WME, for instance, subject to standards, from a 2,000 square foot restaurant to a 4,000 square foot restaurant. And for $1 per square foot, I'm trying to understand what that looks like. $2,000 a year to double the size of your restaurant.
Dan, let me stop you just for a sec, because I think you're getting a little ahead of things here. So the above, this is the section in the ordinance that really speaks to the current language in the city code that refers to these incentives. It says, if there is an increase in non-maritime uses granted through the above incentives, a fee established by resolution of city council set forth in the fee schedule shall be assessed to the property owner for the purpose of supporting the Annapolis Maritime Industry Economic Development Fund. And so it's just been kind of corrected a little bit here to refer to the right sections. But, this ordinance doesn't explain what these incentives are, and that's problematic in some way for you all to understand what we're talking about. So I wanted to explain what we're talking about. And this is in that Maritime Task Force report, page 17. It goes into pretty good detail about this idea that was sort of developed by the task force, that, where there was a lot of interest in public water access improvements within the maritime districts, particularly, but also citywide. And this mechanism where a property owner would receive a modest increase in the available non-maritime uses they could have would be allowed if they provided a certain amount of water access improvement. And so we clarified that in the code. I'll show you what that looks like in a second. But this is how it's described. Concept of offering additional incentives for flexibility on non-maritime development was widely seen as the most likely avenue for property owners to partner on new public water access projects. So, and this sentence here is really important. The task force concluded that a 5% incentive would be offered in all the maritime districts in exchange for public water access. So it's, in this description, water access is pretty vague, but in that 2521 bill that was approved, it added quite a bit of detail to what we're talking about in terms of public water access. It's hard to see here, but what you may be able to make out is there's category 1, maximum of 5% total, and that those types of water access improvements include water taxi landing, which would give you 2.5% additional gross floor area for non-maritime use. Public access for walking during daylight hours, so like a boardwalk, like what you see outside of the Chop Tank restaurant, for example. 2.5% of gross floor area additional. Renting to tenants that provide recreational water access, like a paddle rental, 2.5% gross floor area. A location for the launch and recovery of paddlecraft. And then E would be a location for crabbing and fishing during daylight hours. So these are all essentially giving 2.5% of your gross additional of your gross floor area could be used for non-maritime. So pretty modest amount. And then category 2 is a bit more, and this is up to 10%, provision of at least 150 on-site parking spaces at a reasonable fee on evenings and weekends would grant 10% of gross floor area. There's really only one site that can do that, and that's the Annapolis City Marina. And this was really intended to ensure that they could have, that they would provide that. A one-time payment of $250,000 to the city for improving street end parks at 5% gross floor area. Community boating facility with small vessel storage and launch areas, lockers, restroom facilities, and parking at 10%, and that would give you 10% additional non-maritime use based on your gross floor area. And so there's this additional provision that you don't have to provide additional on-site parking if you do these types of water access imprint. That was basically seen as a, somebody might be able to do one of these water access improvements, but then not be able to provide any parking for visitors. We didn't want to make that a constraint. And then at the bottom, this is that part that's in the bill where it specifies that if there is an increase in non-maritime uses granted to the above incentives, a fee established by resolution of the City Council and set forth in the fees schedule shall be assessed to the property owner for the purpose of supporting the Annapolis Maritime Industry Fund. So this is kind of a long way of saying that there's this fee is really only going to apply to the few businesses that choose to take advantage of this water access incentive. And as of now, we're only aware of one. There is only one property that has taken advantage of it, and that is the Annapolis City Marina, which dedicated 150 of those parking spots in their garage. And they basically had to do that. They canceled several contracts that they had with other providers, other tenants to dedicate those spots. The only piece of this ordinance that we feel is unclear and should be amended is this section, which is on the last page, where, and this, I know when the Maritime Advisory Board reviewed this ordinance, there were several folks on that board that were confused by this, rightly so. This is establishing the purpose of this fund, and it has these 3 purposes. And really none of these were in that Maritime Task Force report. So we reached out to the law office who had drafted this ordinance, and it turns out these are actually the purpose statements for the fund from 1988. So for the purposes of being more up to date on this, we would recommend that the purpose of this fund lean on what was said in the Maritime Task Force report, which is essentially this: promote the maritime districts while recruiting new businesses, retain and support expansion of existing maritime services, and diversify and expand workforce training to offer all Annapolitans opportunity to enter the maritime trade. So that's the extent of my slides to try to clarify this. I've probably confused things a little bit more, but can definitely take questions. And sorry to interrupt Diane earlier. I just wanted to try to, I thought I could answer some of this, what you were asking about.
Okay.
Without,
So let me see if I understand it. If a person provides incentives, right, provides racks,
A property owner,
access, the property owner provides incentives, he will be granted an increase in the amount of non-maritime use. And that property owner has to pay $1 per square foot of all non-maritime uses into the fund?
just the non-maritime use that they're that's being activated by those water access incentives.
Okay, and it's a maximum of 5% for that first category. So even if they did 4 of those things, they can only get 5%.
Right.
And in the second category, which really only applies to the city marina, was 10%. Okay.
Yes.
And then he has to pay that $1 per square foot on that 10% increase.
Right.
Okay.
That's right.
Okay. So this only if a person, only if the property owner provides those waterfront access, those initiatives, those public access initiatives,
That's right.
then does he get an increase in the non-maritime use, and he needs to pay that rather modest amount. Okay. It's not then, let me be clear. It's not as if a person just opens up a non-maritime use, rents space for non-maritime uses, opens a restaurant, which is a non-maritime use, that he can pay $1 per square foot and get kind of a quote fee in lieu. Does not say that.
Does not say that.
Okay.
There are still very strict allowances for total non-maritime use in the districts. This is just a slight.
I think that was the initial confusion with this. I don't think it was explained properly, but this makes much more sense.
Well, and I think one of the incentives, maybe you can go over this again, Eric, is you can pay 250,000 and get a 5% of gross floor area additional fee. I mean, additional space. Is that right?
I think it was actually up to 10%. Let me double check.
Because there are a couple of spots in Eastport right now that I'm sure it's a restaurant could pay a one-time fee of 250 and get that, they would do it. So that's one of the issues is how is this going to work? How is it practical? How is it going to impact us practically speaking? Because 250,000, especially if it's one time, is not a lot of money for one of these big restaurant chains we're hearing about.
Yeah, it would be for 5% additional gross floor area. Yeah, so it's a one-time fee for that. It's a one-time donation essentially of $250,000, but then they would still be hit with this fee every year of $1 square foot.
But for let's say right now, a 2,000 square foot restaurant, which you can have in WME, subject to standards, decides that they're going to pay a one-time fee for $250,000, and then they decide, okay, the gross floor area of their, a building perhaps that they're calling maritime, which is actually residential use, but that maybe the city just doesn't know because the data isn't getting collected. That's one of the problems that I have here is that we know there's flaws in 2521 that we need to fix. And we talked about that in various memos that our planning commission sent to city council that my understanding may not have gone to city council at all right now. So the underlying legislation with reporting requirement problems and with what happens if somebody violates their maritime use, that's not getting fixed. And we're, marching forward with this be. So I'm just trying to figure out how this all fits together. Shouldn't we fix the underlying legislation as we proposed in our memos before we do this? Or is there any downside to that approach?
No, I mean, keep in mind that there's a pretty rigorous permitting process for any new business that opens. It's not as if a restaurant or any other business that's looking to open is just suddenly going to open overnight. I mean, they have to go through a pretty rigorous permitting process that, because it's in the maritime zone, there's a lot of scrutiny. And, to put it in perspective, what happened at the Annapolis City Marina that allowed them to use the water access, they wanted to take advantage of the water access incentives. There was a women's clothing boutique that was interested in opening, and it was going to knock them slightly above their non-maritime use allowance. And so they needed to activate the water access incentive. So, through the review process in our department, we had to confirm that, the 150 parking spaces that would be required to take advantage of water access was actually going to happen. And so we had to, through several meetings with the ownership at the city marina, we had to basically understand, who is actually using the parking today, which tenants of theirs, how many spaces are they required to have. And it became clear that they had a few contracts with neighboring businesses that they weren't going to be able to continue having if we wanted to have these 150. So it was just a very rigorous process just for a women's clothing store. You can imagine a restaurant trying to open would probably be even more of a extended process. They're going to have
So
parking
you won't
requirements.
use the data that you currently have. You would then say, even though you reported such as your non-maritime or your maritime use, you'd still go and look at it and say somebody is using a bunch of space right now as they're calling it maritime and they're non-maritime, and the city, for whatever reason, isn't enforcing it. You would then go back and enforce it and make sure that
Yes.
is correct.
Yes, what we have to do whenever a non-maritime use is proposed, we have to do a deep dive into that property, understand who's there today. Essentially, that's a point where we can actually get really good data that might not come through the annual, that we may have trouble getting just through the annual reporting. But when we have to actually permit them for something, we get a better response, I think. So I know Stephen, is going to be working through the challenges, the annual reporting, and is going to be staying on top of it. And I think it's going to get easier year by year, but I think the first time is, certainly a new thing and challenging. But yeah, we don't allow the non-maritime use until we have a really thorough understanding of what's there today.
And then the gross floor area, in the case of $250,000 property owner pays that amount, and they also pay annually 5% of the gross floor area of the non-maritime use or of their entire gross floor area for their maritime or non-maritime.
Just that 5%.
That ends up being a little pittance, but just saying.
Yeah, that's you're absolutely right. It's not going to yield a ton of money. Unfortunately,
I think we're going to be making a mistake, but all right. Yeah. Thanks for your help. I guess the answer is this fund doesn't get at the root of the problems, and that has to happen separately. And we just need to push on making the changes that we suggested in our memos that City Council hasn't seen yet on 2521.
Yeah, I mean, the City Council could certainly set additional fees if they want to. I mean, there could be other ways of generating revenue for the fund. In fact, in the Maritime Task Force report, I mean, there was a recommendation to use tax revenue, and I mean, none of that really flew once it got to City Council, and there was more discussion about it. But there could definitely be other ways of adding money to the fund, for sure.
And so, yeah, and if we wanted to revisit the dollar per square foot, we have to do that in another venue. This is not the time to look at the fees that we may not think are appropriate. We just go back
That's right.
to,
That's something that can be updated annually. So the fees are reviewed annually. So it's not something that might not get looked at for 5 years. I mean, there's an opportunity to change that next year, frankly, if we want to.
so I know the Maritime Advisory Board voted unanimously against it. And that you were going to, they were asking you to rewrite it. I don't think you're going to be rewriting.
I told them, the city council would rewrite it, but in my view, it's really just that those purpose clauses at the last page of this, they seem foreign to people who've been involved with the maritime districts in recent years because they came from 1988. So that's the one area in my mind that just should be amended, and the planning commission can make that recommendation. But everything else, even though it's confusing, there's nothing improper or incorrect about it.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. Riley?
I was just going to say, I'm sorry, I just thought of that. As long as it's being looked at by the Maritime Advisory Board, is there any problem if we waited until the Maritime Advisory Board looked at it again? Or what's your thought on that?
Well, I mean,
they're kind of the experts.
Yeah, I don't know that it makes sense to wait for another month for them to look at it again, because it's not going to change again. It's not going to be, I mean, you could make a recommendation to city council and they can decide, to amend it, and then it could, there's time for testimony for, city council. But yeah, I don't think the Maritime Advisory Board is going to be rewriting it or reviewing it again. So.
Well, I know they won't be, but I think they had asked you to do something, and I remember you saying, well, I can't rewrite it, but you would recommend that it do something before it, because after they voted it down, I thought you were recommending that it come back to them somehow.
No, I don't think I recommend it come back. I think I said I was going to suggest to the planning commission that, they'd take a hard look at it, but.
Oh, okay.
I don't remember my exact words.
If I could just offer a comment on Diane's question. This change is really a pragmatic change that is required by the finance department. So the city can begin to accept and deposit funds that have been, or fees that have been assessed. There is an outstanding fee that is being assessed to one property owner already, and we just simply can't place it in anywhere within the city's budget framework until this fund gets codified. So I know there are bigger policy issues around this, but this specific ordinance amends the zoning code in a very minor way. And that's the only reason that's presented to you this evening, because it's a Title 21 amendment, and we're required.
Is it a lot of money that we're talking about here that needs to be put somewhere?
It's about $5,000.
I didn't realize it was
money
so
that
little.
could have been placed in the budget last year, and we're still not. So we have to fix this budget issue, and that's what the intent of this at its heart is.
And why is it an ordinance when usually finance department sets up funds and things like that? Why would it come back as an ordinance? Just curious.
The ordinance as it is now, 21, references the fund, but it refers to it in a way that under a different name. So this corrects the name of it. It just locks it all in place, and it was a result of a meeting between the finance department, the law office, and planning and zoning department that this technical change needed to be made to make sure that the government was operating efficiently and with transparency. That's all this is about.
Got it.
Thanks.
Thanks.
Steve, Riley, anything?
No, I'm just I think I'm with Tommy. I think we both learned something on this call, just the 5% and the caps and that kind of stuff. It gives the level of ease or comfort. This has been going on long before I got here, and it's
Right.
complicated with, the different ordinances and it's kind of bounced back and forth. So I'm with Eric, like, you don't need this to bounce around anymore. What Chris was saying and that 5%, it seems very kind of straightforward to me. The fear or the worry that I had from the start, which is what I'm going to hear from any of our constituents, is, oh, $1 a square foot, like this is nothing to these guys. It's like pocket change, but that's not really what it's about. It's just about kind of enforcing what's already been there, and it's the caps are the limit anyway. And so it's much more clear to me after this call.
Yeah.
But if it took me kind of 2 or 3 goes, being on the inside looking at this, then you can imagine other people who are kind of coming in and they say things, or they get bits and pieces of it and they don't have the whole story. So consolidating it into something that's really digestible, I think, is a kind of a critical need. And I guess the planning commission could be the one that can tie all that together now.
Right. And as long as we have the ability to go back and help fix, I mean, I don't know if we can fix it, but we're trying to make recommendations, and we're willing to work with public planning and zoning on how do we make the reporting requirements work, because right now everyone thinks they're too draconian. How do we tackle some of the things that we mentioned in our memos to city council? So this isn't the way to do it. We need to go back and fix that stuff. It just feels backwards, like we're actually putting this fund together to accept money for a ordinance, or now a law that has flaws in it that we need to fix. I'd rather fix the flaws and then do this, but I understand what you're saying, which is we really have to do this first.
Yeah, it's complicated because it sets up these. One of the things that this advisory task force a couple of years ago, brought to the surface is that there's very little public access to the water. So how do you make a deal with the property owners to provide more waterfront access initiatives? And that's where they get their little 5% and in one case 10%. So it's confusing in a way. What comes across, what seems like a fee in lieu, is not actually. I have a specific, Tom, anything?
No, I'm good. You guys have said it all.
I have 2 questions. One for Eric. We talk about square footage and in increases in square footage. What are we basing that on? I'm not quite sure. You've got a property of, I don't know, 100 square feet, and he's got 30% non-maritime and 70% merit, whatever. Is it the total land footage, or is it only building footages that are increased?
Well, it's complicated. I think it varies from between maritime districts. I think in there's one of them where they look at the entire square footage inside and out, but I think primarily it's the indoor building square footage, of all the occupied spaces. But I can't recall which district. There's at least one. There's one district that I believe uses the outdoor areas as well. But that calculation, it's generally the occupied space of the buildings. It doesn't distinguish between maritime or non-maritime. It's just the gross. But
well, I know it's the growth. Is it?
Yeah.
Some of these properties have huge amounts of open space where they're hauling boats around in some of these marinas. Others of them are very compact, and there's essentially a building that takes up the whole property. So do you determine square footage from the gross land area, the total, or do you determine it just from the building? And you say it's different in the 3 zones? Let
me see if I can find the answer while we're on. It's at least 3 of the zones, it's just the occupied building square footage.
Do you know which ones they are?
Yeah, I'm gonna have to.
I mean, there are 4 zones, but one of them is city dock. We don't need to talk about that.
Right. Let's see.
While you look at that, and I think that the reason I ask is because unless
Bob,
you,
I can tell you,
Mhm.
when it comes to the water act, so I was confusing myself a little bit, because the percentages related to non-maritime in general vary, from zone to zone. But when you're talking about the water access incentives, it is very specific. It says the term GFA means the gross floor area of buildings existing on the lot as of October 25th, 2021, not including residential structures. Yeah, so it's gross. So when you're trying to calculate the percentage area that you can take advantage of with these water access incentives, you're looking at gross floor area of buildings that are there as of 2021 when that
including residentials.
excluding residential.
Okay,
Yeah.
that's a very important thing. That's very important to know.
Yeah.
So okay. Okay.
So you're not going to look at the boatyard, exterior area in that circumstance.
Great. Okay. My second questions have to do, well, let me preface this by saying, based upon the concerns of from the public comments that we've got and I take this opportunity to suggest to the council some of the things that they need to do. And for that, I'm going to talk to Mr. Rice, because it has to do with our earlier discussions on reporting and the problems in getting solid reporting and the penalties for not reporting. Good evening, Mr. Rice. How are you?
Good.
Thank you for being here. I remember a few points that we made, and I would like to hear from you to make sure that they're complete. One of the things that we determined is that the reporting should be done not by the tenant, but by the owner of the properties. Is that what we determined? Or by some designated property manager? What did you find that you think it should be?
Yeah, we're requesting the reports from the property owner, but in instances in which the property manager can provide the information, that would be advantageous, but the requests go to the property owner.
Okay. And you don't always know who the manager is, or unless you begin to learn,
Correct, or the owner.
or even the owners. Well, there's always a resident agent for any business that owns the property, correct? There's always a resident agent. Any corporation has to have a resident agent to accept correspondence.
Yeah, I mean, we have addresses.
Okay, I'm just saying it's difficult because they live in Florida. They got a yacht. They're in,
Absolutely.
And so
A lot of them are LLCs.
right.
PO boxes.
The
Correct.
LLC it's got to have any corporation's got to have a resident agent. It's listed in the Department of Assessments and Taxation. It's usually a lawyer. Some of these offices collect for hundreds, if not thousands, of businesses, and they're responsible for forwarding. Okay, I'm just saying that's in terms of mechanics, but it's the property owner who's going to be assessed. Is that right?
The property owner would be you talking about the assessment of
any penalty?
fee?
Yeah, any penalty.
Correct.
Not reported. Okay. Second thing then, didn't we talk about doing two things? One, increasing the fines, the penalties to where they're actually stung, and doing away with this what's the word I'm looking for? Yanking their use and occupancy permit. We thought that that was a draconian penalty that would not be, we wouldn't use, because that would fall onto the tenant and not onto the property owner. Okay, so is that a recommendation that you think should be made to city council?
We did talk about that. I do agree with the recommendation.
Okay,
I thought that was in the report that you sent to council.
I know, but we're going to repeat it.
Well, and it never went to city council from what I understand. Is that right? Or does anyone know the answer to that?
But can you hold on? Can you
Me?
hold
Oh,
on,
yeah.
please? Hold on. You'll
I'm
have,
holding.
you'll have time.
Yeah, I just, okay.
I understand. You've already said that. And we can address that in conclusion. Is there anything else, Mr. Rice, that you have found that you think should be in the reporting requirements? Any other recommendation that we can give some emphasis to? Anything that you found that would be practical?
Nothing comes to mind. But I will give it some thought and circle back.
Well, okay, I mean, we're gonna write this up and we're gonna send it in. Do you have any idea of what the fines or penalties should be? Like really, I mean, they should sting.
Yeah, as I recall from the previous planning commission meeting, I believe the discussion centered around $1,000 for properties that were non-compliant.
Okay.
And I think that's reasonable.
Wait, was that $1,000 per square foot?
No.
Oh, well, $1,000 for not reporting, there's no incentive to report if you're
I
not
don't actually,
using.
I don't recall exactly what, I seem to recall $1,000 being thrown around. But I don't have perfect recollection of what was discussed. I don't have a formal recommendation for an amount.
Well, I mean, in a sense, we're relying on you. You understand the industry, you've done a deep dive into the economics of the thing. You understand how important this reporting requirement is. Okay. And you should have some sense of what would make a sting, what would be, a practical, efficient fine.
I seem to
some people,
recall
$1,000
$1,000 being the discussed as from the general consensus, being something that would cause a sting to property owners that were non-compliant with submitting their reports. And maybe that is or isn't, something that would sting, but that's what I seem to recall from the meeting in meetings in March and April.
I'm asking.
I don't have the minutes.
Personal opinion. I'm asking for your.
I'm sorry?
I'm asking for your personal opinion.
Okay, so I'm recommending $1,000 for non-compliant.
Okay.
Not per
property
square
owners.
foot, right?
I was just going to say, I think it would be worthwhile to look at this in the context of other fines that we assess for other things. I mean, we're neither Stephen or myself are really in the business of doing this. We have inspectors and all variety of people in planning and zoning department that do citations every day. So I don't know. I mean, I feel like it might make sense to look at this in the context of what is our other structure for.
Well, I would suggest that between now and the time that this thing gets voted on, because we're going to make some pretty strong recommendations here that at least the council start to look at it. I think that you guys are familiar with the industry. There's a little guy for whom $1,000 is like out of his pocket. And there's the big guys for whom $1,000 is like what they'd spend on a big dinner for 5 people. Okay, so come up with a formula that makes some sense, that an inspector doesn't have to think about it And it's very clear and bright because we need this reporting done. Because it's on the basis of which we get a sense of where the industry is, where the waterfront, where our zones are. Okay? 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 I mean, come on. And those fines and penalties should go into the fund. Money into fund. Okay. Now, the final thing is the purposes. The one thing that, I mean, you added, I can't remember what you subtracted one of the old purposes, which was to provide matches to grants and whatever, to grants and to matching grants, correct? And you removed that. And what did you add?
All of the three purpose statements on the last page of the ordinance. Let's see if I have it open here. Let me share my screen. It'll be easier.
Let's just take a look. And the only thing is, okay.
So this is the last page, page 4 of the ordinance, where in Title 6 of the City Code, Revenue and Finance, the ordinance adds these sections, and this purpose section, these three statements, A, B, and C, are all from this 1988 ordinance. And honestly, I don't think any of them are really appropriate based on the maritime task. I mean, they might make some sense, but they're not things that were even discussed in the Maritime Task Force in these terms. I mean, public-private partnerships. I mean, yeah, I mean, it makes sense in some way, but it just wasn't. None of these were really discussed in this. So,
what are you recommending?
Well, in the Maritime Task Force report, there is a page 16 has these 3 bullet points. Basically these are much more in line with what the task force was discussing. So you could simply, and I could send this Word document version of this, so you could just copy and paste, but it's essentially promote, these 3 items.
Do you need the business of using the fund for matching for grants? Do you need to add that as a purpose?
I don't think it needs to be that specific, honestly. I think.
Okay. All right. I think you're going to find out. Okay.
Yeah.
Yes, I would ask that you. Okay, I'll do the findings on this. So no, Diane Butler is going to do the findings on this. Okay, Ms. Butler.
Yes, that sounds good. Thank you.
So send it to her and to me. Okay. All right. Are there any other? Let's go back to our regular screen. Are there any other questions of Mr. Rice or Mr. Leshinsky? All right. I understand that Mr. Ross Arnett would like to testify, and could we bring him in? And is there anybody else in the wings who would like to give live testimony?
No, there's no one else.
All right, thank you. Mr. Arnett?
I'm trying to get there. There we are.
You're
Can you
here.
hear me?
Yes.
All right. So I mercifully, because Eric did such a fabulous job of anticipating all the things that I'm hearing from my constituents, and I hope his slides will be incorporated in your report to us. I really only have one thing to point out to you, which is most of the errors or problems I think with this legislation are in Title VI. So if you look at page 4, it refers to 630-010 3 times. There is no 630-010 or 020. I do agree with, again, Mr. Leshinsky, that the purpose section of this needs to conform to what we did with the task force. And I'm looking forward to getting the report from the Planning Commission on this and the reports from you on the things you did as far as reporting from the maritime industry. So how's that for brief?
That's very good. Mr. Arnett, as you get older, you're getting briefer. I think that's great.
Well,
I
I
do
would
have a
add,
question for you in terms of timing. If we don't get to reviewing and voting on our findings until the September meeting, is that going to cause any delay in anything?
The Rules Committee meets on September 5th. But I don't, other than having a legitimate place for Director Dickinson to park the dollars, I don't think that there's that much urgency. We can always, if you need more time, we can always hold I'll have to talk to the chair of the Rules Committee, but I think we can always hold a special meeting to deal with this. So
our first meeting is on the 5th as well.
Well, not if we pass legislation that's before the council. There will not be board and commission meetings when the council is meeting. Oh, okay. I'm sorry. You're right. This is a committee meeting. Yeah. All right. Well, so it won't make it to us in time. So it'll have to go to the Rules Committee in October.
Okay.
I have one comment. Alderman Arnett, I know that you watched one of our planning commission meetings where we had voted on findings, and it was or actually recommendations to city council. That was on May 14th, and then a subsequent one on June 6th. And I was under the impression that all went to city council, and I think you said or alluded to the fact that you hadn't seen those. Is there a public place where our information goes, like in Granicus or?
There's a slip because of the retirement of Jackie Wells. I have seen an unsigned copy of the May 14th, and I do have some comments and issues about that. I have not seen the June, and so it has not been transmitted to the Rules Committee, which is the committee that will deal with this. So,
or city council, right? Even though our memo says to city council from planning
absolutely.
commission, we don't control that. So it's not like we're trying to hold
No,
that
no,
up. It may be
I
somebody
actually-
in planning and zoning that might know.
I've spoken to the director who is on this thing. So we need to get that squared away. It's just a transition problem that we got to get fixed.
Ms. Butler, do you have a copy of that June 6th?
I do, but I feel uncomfortable sharing it unless it's a public document, but it's not anywhere publicly right now besides our commission. So I don't know what the rules are about that. If I have permission to share it with council members, I'm happy to.
Yeah, I would suggest that you send it to Eric, to Mr. Lashinsky, and make sure that that gets done. And then he'll just kind of follow through on it, and he'll distribute it to council members.
Perfect.
Or see that it's done. Okay.
Just another
right.
job Eric needs to have, right?
Right. One more thing. When God gave burdens, he gave shoulders. That's an old Jimmy Carter saying. All right. If there's nobody else, I would like to make sure that the written comment that was received will be made part of the record. I would suggest that the slides that we received be made part of the public record. So if Mr. Lashinsky could maybe forward them to Kim Consoli, just to make, and they're very good, and it was very obviously very helpful. And with that, I'm going to close the public hearing. Discussion? Okay. Look, here's what for whatever it's worth. First of all, I move that we recommend approval of this. It's Mr. Jakubiec said, it's really some housekeeping here, and it's not really changing anything. So it's somewhat much ado about nothing. But on the other hand, it's also brought up all sorts of things about the maritime zones. And one of them that we have focused on, and I suggest that we reiterate and emphasize to council the need to change the reporting process. that, you know, who is obligated to report, not the tenant, but the property owner or a designated agent. That the penalties be significantly higher, but that revoking the use and occupancy permit is draconian and should be struck. And that the any monies raised should be put into this fund, which is negligible amounts of money in this fund. That's all. That's it. We just take the opportunity to make that emphasis and we recommend approval. So that's my motion. Do I hear?
Can I clarify before I vote on the motion? But
Yes.
when you're talking about the reporting requirement and that we did discuss how revoking someone's use and occupancy permit based on non-reporting is probably a little too strong of a penalty. We're just talking about reporting requirements. Everyone agrees that if you're violating your maritime use percentages completely, that is the place where you revoke or use permit or use and occupancy permit. I just want to clarify that because I think in one of maybe the first report that we did, it wasn't as clear, but thank you for, I think, clarifying that.
Right. I don't know that we've had discussion about what should happen for we're not on that topic. We're on a topic.
Right.
And I think that we should narrow it, and because that can get done if somebody wants to do it. Okay. And you may be correct, but it's a different topic.
Right. But do we want to add to your motion, rephrasing those 3 purpose statements or maybe deleting them because they're not necessary, the ones that were added?
Well, yes, I mean, I would recommend that the purposes that were mentioned by Lashinsky, which come directly from that huge, long study and report, just become the purposes here, rather than the 1988 purposes. So that would be a second kind of recommendation, sub-recommendation. I'll accept that. Now, with that, do I have a second?
Second.
All right. Any further discussion on this? I want to I think that, as usual, Eric Lashinsky did a wonderful job of just sort of encapsulating this and making it clear. It's complicated. All right. Hearing nothing, all in favor of that recommendation, say aye.
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 Any nays? All right.
I think Eric may be one of the only people that really understand it. Maybe Eileen Fogarty.
No, I think we understand it now.
I know, but we don't have just the variation between the zones and the different language. It is complicated. You have to look at it each and every time.
And I thought the explanation of square footages was really helpful too. I mean, not only like how those access initiatives work, but secondly, knowing where that square footage is calculated is really important. Because I could see some of these guys in these big outfits really wanting to stash all kinds of non-maritime uses, you know, spas and parachute drops and all sorts of things. All right. Having no further business, nothing else on our agenda for tonight. I would ask that we get our findings in really well in advance of Labor Day. Let's just get it done while it's fresh in mind. Let's get it done, and then we can edit, and then we'll have a lot to do on the 5th. You watch. Anything further? Motion to adjourn?
So moved.
Any second?
Second.
All in favor? Say
Aye.
aye. I will see you all on September the 5th. Have a wonderful time for the rest of the summer, huh?